Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is Game 5 from the 2014 World Chess Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Viswanathan Anand. Going into this round, both players remain level at 2 points apiece. And Anand, with the white pieces in this one, he opened with d4. We have yet to see anything different when Anand has the white side. Games 1 and 3 saw the same thing. How will things be different in this one? After knight f6, c4, and e6, we're following Game 3 so far, with still knight f3. In Game 3, at this moment here, we saw d5. This is where things change. Instead, we enter a Queen's Indian with b6, g3. Black inserts this check in order to inconvenience the queen bishop, and only then return to e7. This is a bit awkward with the bishop on d2. It's off the back rank, but it gets in the way of the queen from seeing the d4 and d5 squares. So eventually he'll have to move again. Knight c3, bishop b7, bishop g2, and with c6 black is prepping this d5 advance. White plays e4. There's castles as well here. And e4, well, white goes with e4. Looking to maybe kick the knight around if black is careless with castles. That's something that we likely would not have. But after e4, it is instead black following through, swinging the back completely around. d5 it is. And now e takes d. Doing something other than e takes d, such as e5, the knight can simply drop right into the center and is immune from capture. Knight takes, pawn takes, he's hit, and d4 would fall. So it is instead e takes d, c takes d, and now knight to e5. A typical move when you have that kingside fianchettoed bishop. You will look for that opportunity, in other words, to move the knight, open the diagonal, and, well, improve the knight's position, really. Knight e5 does just that, and now this pawn on the d5 square is in a pin. Both sides castle, and now knight to c6, challenging the one piece in the black position, getting another developing move in. C takes d, and not the immediate recapture. This is a very delicate position. It's delicate, or it's critical, because there are ways that the pawn structure can change. As an example, if black is immediately recapturing on d5 with the knight, there can follow knight takes knight, and after the pawn takes, we have this ram structure, and white has some play here after queen to a4. Pressure on c6, ensuing pressure here, and if black wants to release that, he may very well have to change the structure again, and I don't know how favorable a structure this is on the black side. I don't know that this is an asset in such a position to work with an isolated d-pawn in such a simplified position. White would have a very strong pawn chain and can play against that d-pawn. Rook a to d1, bishop c3, very nice posts for the white pieces. So in other words, black will not be so quick to recapture on d5. After c takes d, we don't have knight takes, but rather knight on c takes e5, and now white too needs to be careful. We don't have the immediate recapture, but instead something else. If d takes e in this position, we can now have knight takes d5, and this pawn on e5 is, I think we can say, a bit overextended. I don't know that this is so inconvenient to the black side, and I'm seeing it more as a liability than an asset. One day, could even have this bishop putting pressure on this pawn. I think we could quickly have a good versus bad bishop type of situation. As an example, if rook c1, we can have knight takes knight, bishop takes, king takes, and exchange queens. I don't know that there's really anything so wrong with that. And again, this pawn one day could maybe be targeted. Will it really be enough for It's not any better for any side, but I'm just seeing no benefit to go into this variation where there's a pawn on e5 and a potential target. We don't have that. We don't, once again, just like we did not have an immediate recapture on d5 with a knight or a pawn, after knight takes on e5, we don't have an immediate recapture, but instead, this sneaky move d6, hitting the bishop and throwing a punch at this unprotected queen bishop on b7. The follow-up is knight to c6. Keep in mind, if as white you go ahead, or excuse me, if as black you go ahead and capture on g2, well, notice you're now going to have to play a position where you have the rook versus white's two minor pieces. Since d takes e7 is coming with great effect, that's a fork, queen takes pawn is necessary, and now you still don't do anything about the bishop on g2. Have a lot of in-between moves here, these past few variations. Pawn takes knight would follow, and after bishop takes rook, like I was saying, we would enter a position where it's a rook and a pawn, in this case, a rook and a pawn versus the two minor pieces. White stands the better side. We'll have perfect homes for these minor pieces, and while there's this open file, it's not really one that could be made use of. Bishop on e3 is a fantastic piece. Would watch over the d2 square, that entry point for a black rook. And the knight is watching over d1. White is, without question, the preferred side. So, that's why we're not having bishop takes bishop here, but instead knight c6. And with this, white is able to do what exactly? Well, they've just picked up the bishop pair. And now with bishop g5, throws the knight in a pin, looking for ideas such as d5 breaking in the center, maybe jumping a knight into d5, exploiting the pin against the knight. So let's see how black copes with that. First, trying to get out of the pin with h6, throws a question to that guy. And once again, we have this in-between move. Many in-between moves so far in this game. Not the typical reaction to the threat on the bishop, but rather d5, throwing a punch at the knight. The knight runs to the edge. Doing something other than that, well, black is getting killed. Like I was saying here, this would be piling up on that pinned piece, striking at the queen and the knight. So therefore, the knight immediately runs away, doing something else like taking the bishop. Well, this is a passed pawn, and he's throwing a punch at the bishop. This is not a good idea for the black side. It's too strong. So we have the knight immediately reacting to the threat. Knight a5 it is. And now bishop takes knight finally. Queen takes, and then pawn takes. I would like to point out one variation here. It's very important at this stage here, after bishop to g5 and h6, it's very important that you not, let's say, only go here to induce this weakness, such as this h6 move, or in other words, if you're dropping back, if you're doing something that's strictly defensive or reactionary, not posing a great threat or not throwing a strong punch with your next move, if you're dropping back for some reason to e3, here's how bad things can turn for white from a positional standpoint, from a strategic standpoint. There's this very convenient reply, knight b4. The light square bishops will be exchanged, and this knight will be enormous on the d5 square. The short story here is that black will have a wonderful position where there is a strong knight on d5 that will essentially go unchallenged. Black will have a strong knight versus a very bad bishop on e3. White, in other words, is wise to make sure he takes out this knight. Otherwise, he's kind of a dead piece in the position. So, after d5, knight a5, sure enough, we do have bishop takes knight, queen takes, d takes e, queen takes e, and now rook to e1, very logical, playing on an open file and doing so with tempo. Queen f6, the most logical move, very good move, keeping her off of the open files, keeping a watchful eye over the e7 square, potential entry point for a white rook, and staying out of harm's way of the light square bishop. If there's only one color bishop remaining, Ideally, if you can, you'd like to keep your queen on an opposite color so there's no ensuing tempo-type moves against her, by the bishop at least. Following up, knight d5. Well, as it stands right now, let's just take a moment to assess the position. There's no imbalance with those last handful of moves. As soon as this d5 advance was played right here, as soon as these guys are exchanged, well, as it stands right now, there's this isolated pawn, but as soon as he is exchanged, there is no imbalance with regard to the pawn structure. Liquidated the pawn structure in the center has been liquidated, and the attention now turns towards piece activity. No imbalance with the pawn structure. Who stands better, however, with the pieces? White is the preferable side, if only because of, let's say, these knight positions. He's not so well placed on a5, and the one on c3 is a bit better. He could jump into d5, and he does so right now. That's what Anand chooses on this move 20. Knight d5 it is. So I was just saying there's no imbalance with regard to pawn structure, but now we do have an imbalance. After knight d5, bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop. Look at how dominant this bishop is on d5. He is doing what exactly? He's doing everything, basically, boxing out the knight. There's not a great way to get him back into play. The bishop is also striking at f7. Certainly an accessible point to not only a rook, but maybe even a queen when she arrives on f3. We do, in fact, get to see that. But first things first, after this recapture on d5, the rook is hit. Rook d8, nice reaction. Right, the rook was hit, he reacts and now puts the bishop in a pin. White needs to get out of that. The typical get out of the pin as soon as you can idea. Queen f3. And now queen takes b2. This was an important decision to take on b2 or do something else. Taking on this square, white has the superior minor piece and will still be pressing in this position for sure, trying to enter on the 7th rank. And you could give this knight a kick. You could enter here. There might even be some lines where the bishop is able to, I don't know, throw a punch at one of the black pieces and control h7. I don't know that h7 at this point would be a reliable flight square for the black king. g6 would probably be needed at some point, so this move, an additional move in other words, would still be needed on the black side before the king has a reliable flight square, whereas white has absolutely no issues. No time would be needed in order for the white king to be nice and cozy with his flight square. g2 is perfect. I should also note one other important detail right here, one other important variation. This moment right here, that knight was snapped right off with bishop takes knight. But this was a very interesting line, one that can also have translated into an imbalance in the form of two minor pieces versus a rook. Once again, in white's favor. If the knight is not taken here on this move 20 by black, suppose queen takes b2, there can follow this very forcing line, surprisingly enough. Rook e2, the queen does not have very many options. In fact, her only choice is a3. Going elsewhere, where else is she going to go? b5, she gets hit with the fork. a3 is the only safe square. Queen a3, now there's rook e3. She is once again very limited. Going to c5 runs into similar ideas, right? When the rook played to e1 earlier, that came with tempo on the queen. This is once again playing into white's hands, activating another piece. So if the queen at this moment grabbed on b2 instead of bishop takes knight, if we had queen takes pawn, there can follow rook e2, queen a3, rook e3, queen has to come back here. If she's going to d6, the queen is falling now. That's a check and the queen's gone. So the queen would have to come back to b2. There's rook b1. The queen has to take on a2, and now there's rook back over to a1. How is this a little bit different? Why would white want to give up that a pawn? Well, now, after the queen moves, there's pressure here. there can follow rook takes, knight, pawn takes, knight e7 check, and after he moves, there goes this bishop. Once again, a situation where it's the two minor pieces versus the rook and pawn. The rook and two pawns. There's a outside pass pawn. This is a very difficult position to assess. I'm not sure who stands better. The evaluation will read that white is the better side, but in practice, I'm not so sure. This is a very scary passed pawn. Not so easy for the minor pieces to coordinate in a way where they can prevent these guys from advancing. I'm not exactly sure who stands better in this ending. In the earlier variation I was showing, where it was the two minor pieces versus the rook, there was good coordination. Black, in that case, did not have a pass pawn. Things, again, however, are a little bit different here, with black having an outside pass pawn. It's not a variation we went into, but certainly something that was being calculated by both sides. Instead, we had bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, rook a d8, queen f3, and instead of this move here, we have black scooping up a pawn, rook a to d1, and now there's some serious stuff happening. White is down a pawn, but has great play here. This knight has yet to do anything. He's been sidelined. With this last move, white is already threatening ideas of simply entering the 7th rank, adding additional pressure to f7, as well as snipping that f7 pawn right away, just to highlight, making a dummy move. If a6, there's just capture. On rook takes rook, you're dropping that rook in here. In fact, it's already a mate in 8. So my main point here is that there is now two ideas in mind by white. As soon as the rook plays to d1, playing here right away, you're dropping the rook. So after rook a d1, there's this move in mind, snipping on f7 and entering on e7. How does black deal with that? Queen f8, offering a queen exchange. Queens are exchanged at the cost of damaging this structure. White is still able to enter. This pawn is now hit, and f7 is hit. This is a threat in the position. Once again, just to highlight, if a6, there's bishop takes f7 on rook takes. Once again, we're dropping that rook. The f7 pawn, curiously enough, right, these guys here are doubled and isolated. However, this guy here is much more valuable than a7. Without this guy around, that means that the white rook will be sealing this king off from even thinking about getting towards the center of the board, which is his ideal environment since we're in an end game. He wants to be able to step up to g7, play f5, and then make use of this f6 square. So while he's doubled again, he turns out to be much more important, much more valuable than this a7 pawn. So that's why we're having king g7. Black simply does nothing about this pawn here. There is now no bishop takes pawn here since it's not coming with check. Rook takes a7. What was pointed out after the game is that rook c7 would have been another interesting try, trying to do what exactly? Limit this knight, not allow him to get back into play so easily, with ideas of maybe rook to d3. This is an interesting idea. If suppose a6, rook d3, and let's just make another passing move to highlight a particular tactic that's present. If b5, there can follow bishop takes f7. And on rook d3, there's bishop to c4, getting this pawn back. But we didn't have a rook c7. Instead, rook takes a. So now the material is restored, and the attention once again still turns towards what exactly? The minor piece imbalance and the kingside pawn structure. With this last move, white is now, well, white was already in a pin. This pin right here is now being made use of. Black's next move, knight c6, hits the rook. There is no bishop takes knight. You're dropping on d1. So knight c6, and now with rook b7, we're essentially going to enter a position where the queenside pawns have been exchanged. And this is exactly what black would want when it's the bishop versus a knight. If exchange pawns in such a way where they are only on one side of the board, the chessboard basically becomes a bit more narrow, a bit smaller to work with. A smaller environment is a much more ideal environment if you're the side who has the knight. That way he's not having to run from one side of the board to the other. The bishop, he has no issues with doing just that. So having these A and B pawns exchange is exactly what black would want. After knight to c6, we did have rook b7. Another try in order to keep these pawns on board would be rook a4, but as was pointed out in the game, Anand was saying after rook d6, bishop b3, and these rooks being exchanged, he basically went as far as this here, saying that the knight on d4 would be a very strong piece, and it's tough to say that this bishop would be any better than the knight in this position. So instead of rook to a4, trying to preserve these queenside pawns on the board, it was instead rook b7, and now we have these forcing moves, knight b4, rooks are exchanged, the a pawn drops, the b pawn drops, and now the knight can finally return. f5 is in, and this is now simplifying way too much. There go the bishop and knight. Even if black was down a pawn at this point, it's close to being holdable. It's very close to holdable, of course, but you don't even have to play this position down a pawn. f5 is in. We have a bunch of other exchanges. e3 exploits this pin. That's not a problem, though. Rook e4, rook takes f2, king g3, and after rook takes f5, these guys agree to a draw, and it's just a dead draw position. Nothing to do at this point. So this is a match that remains level. If you think back to 2013, after Game 4, I should say Game 5 was a decisive result, and in that match, in the 2013 match, that's where Carlsen pulled ahead 3-2, but this time around we are split. Again, they are level, 2.5 points each, and we go into round 6 tomorrow. So we'll see what takes shape then. As always, I hope you got something out of this video. Take care. Bye.